Hello everyone, welcome to Home-Based Learning for Auditing 2. We will be covering some concepts about audit sampling. After this, you will get to apply attribute sampling on test of control in a short case study. Audit sampling is commonly applied by auditors in performing tests of controls. This involves auditors applying audit procedures to less than 100% of the items in a population. Audit procedures is also known as audit tests, and two very common audit tests used by auditors in tests of control will be number one, inspection of documents. This would mean auditors inspecting documents for evidence of attributes such as a client's signature as proof that the client is performing the controls per the control policy. A second common audit test used in tests of control would be re-performance. Re-performance will involve auditors repeating what the client has done for the controls. Because of the nature of this re-performance, it will involve much more time and effort by the auditors. However, the advantage of re-performance over inspection would be re-performance will result in a much more higher quality evidence for the auditors because it is much more reliable. A second important concept in this particular slide would be that audit sampling means auditors test less than 100% of the population. So for example, assuming auditors is trying to test the controls of proper credit approval for sales, and assuming that the company have 10,000 sales transactions. For the whole year. Auditor cannot test the whole 10,000 sales transaction because it will not be a practical audit. The audit will be very costly and it will be very time consuming because of the sheer volume. Instead, sampling will involve auditors choosing his samples from these 10,000 sales transactions for evidence of proper credit approval. This is what we meant by sampling. When auditors does sampling, he is very careful in his selection because he wants the samples that he chooses to be representative of the population. Representative of the population means that the samples shares the same characteristic as the rest of the population that is not being tested. So in our earlier example, in the 10,000 sales transaction, for the auditors to have more confidence that his sample is representative, one way that he can do is to spread out his samples over the months. So he will pick his samples likely from January, February, March, April, May, so on and so forth until December. So he will have some samples from January, some samples from February, some samples from March, and the rest of the months. In this case, he has minimized the risk that his samples is not representative of the population. In practice, auditors usually choose samples either randomly or haphazardly. The first one is also known as a statistical sampling, and one way auditors can use random sample is to use the random function in the Microsoft Excel. Okay, another method would be hazard sampling. This will mean non-statistical sampling. This meant auditors choosing his samples based on his own predefined attributes that he feels are important. Okay, when we talk about sampling risk, we have earlier covered that sampling risk arises when the auditors chooses sample that is not representative of the population. In reality and in practice, auditors can never be certain that his samples is 100% representative unless he tests all of the population. This will never happen in practice unless the population is so small. So because of this element of uncertainty, there is a risk that the auditor may end up with the wrong conclusion. This wrong conclusion can be either So the wrong conclusion in test of control could be either the control is effective or the control is not effective, when in actual fact it is the opposite. This is because auditors may end up choosing samples that is not representative. So for the first one, in actual fact control may be ineffective, but because of the non-representative sample selected by auditors, he may end up with this wrong conclusion. Between number 1 and number 2, both are not good for the auditors, but between 1 and 2, one of these wrong conclusions have a much more serious impact on auditors. Can you guess which one? Okay, the answer will be number 1. Okay, number 1 will affect auditors' audit effectiveness. Because of this wrong conclusion in number 1, auditors may have wrongly relied on control and adopted a reliance strategy. Reliance strategy means auditors, because of his wrong conclusion that control is effective, he is now wrongly relying on control to reduce his substantive test. Because of his reduction in substantive test, auditors may then fail to discover material error such that he ended up with the incorrect or inappropriate audit opinion. Okay, on the other hand, number 2, whereby auditors wrongly conclude that control is not effective when in actual fact it is effective, these men auditors will have wrongly adopted a substantive strategy. Okay, while this wrong conclusion does not affect audit effectiveness, it affects the auditor's efficiency because he will now have performed unnecessary substantive tests. This meant that the audit would be a less profitable audit. Okay, to put what we have discussed in perspective, auditors perform tests of control. They will test important control to justify the preliminary control risk assessment that they have. So when we say preliminary control risk assessment, we are referring to planning. When auditor does planning, they will look at the design, the implementation of the controls done by management. They will come up with an initial assessment. So if they conclude that the design, the implementation of management is good, the initial control risk assessment is likely to be low. Because this initial risk assessment is only in theory, auditor now need to test this control to validate whether these controls are really effective in practice. So this is what we meant by test of control. So test of control is needed to validate auditor's assessment, auditor's initial assessment. Okay, this is like auditors have a conclusion this is like auditors have an assumption about control's effectiveness. Auditors now need to validate this assumption via test of control before they can decide whether or not to really rely on the controls implemented by management. When auditors does test of control, they will want to determine what is the deviation rate. Deviation rate means the number of exceptions, i.e. the number of times clients do not follow the control procedures. Based on this deviation rate, auditor will then determine what is the computed upper deviation rate. This meant the worst case scenario. That means if you expand the testing based on all the errors you found, what is the worst case scenario? What is the maximum number of errors that is likely in the whole population? They will compare this worst case scenario with what they can tolerate. So auditors will compare worst case scenario with the tolerable deviation rate, what they can tolerate. Once the worst case scenario or CUDR exceeds TDR, the appropriate conclusion is for the auditor not to rely on the control. The reverse will be true. Okay, with this we have ended our short discussion about audit sampling. We have a very short, or maybe it's not short, we have a short case whereby you can try to apply the audit sampling concepts in the test of control. Hope it helped you. Thank you.